otherwise you can stand like this. And James, please go to the man in the green shirt. Hello? Hello. Yes, you can hear me. I have a practical, or two practical things, or actually three. The first one is if RTM Moiseev is in the room, if there are something with your flights, so please go to the information desk if you, to the registration. They have some message about your flight in Moscow. And then Matula Karitsis, there is not a brown envelope for you in the registration. It's a white envelope. So please go in. I don't know what's in it. I would like to know, of course. And then at 7:30, 19:30 and 19:40, there will be a bus leaving from this place to the stadium where we have the farewell dinner. And you're all invited, and if you have picked someone up during your stay in Aarhus, please bring them, because we've lost a few delegates, so there's plenty of food. And if you live in the city center, there's a bus at 19:40 from Scandic, which is just opposite the railway station. So so that's a chance you have to go by bus. And then at the party from 10:30 and the rest of the evening and until the early morning, there will be shuttle buses circulating, so you can get home or whatever you want to do. But then I have the last announcement is that I will actually, since I'm the, I've actually decided to step down as chairman of this session, since I'm the director of the Danish Institute for Sports Studies and play the game, because I learned from this conference that it's not good governance to be a chairman and a director on the same time. And then actually from the beginning we planned to be two chairmen, because we thought we were going to be so tired that we couldn't really concentrate what they said anyway. So, but as you know, Mogens is already a president of ISCA, the International Sport and Culture Association. So he is now also actually stepping down to a lower level as a chairman. And I think that's a good example that many of those presidents we have heard about during this could maybe learn from this stepping down. So I will but now I will leave it to you to present the speakers. That is because he was challenging me, so we switched off his microphone.
Thank you very much, and I can assure you that stepping down from president to chairman is only temporarily. But welcome to this last session of Play the Game 2013. We will try to recap and wrap up the 4 days you have participated in. We have even bigger ambitions. We have high ambitions for this session. We will try to identify the most important challenges for our sector. And even more, we will also try to identify the best solution. In case we do not succeed 100%, let's say we only succeed 50% by pointing out the challenges, I think we should ask the organizers and the supporters to play the game again. This is not to demotivate you, but just to say that we might have a challenge here that is hard to overcome. However, with your help and the help from 4 speakers from very different sectors and backgrounds, we hope we can get closer to the challenges as well as the solutions. The procedure for this session will be that we have the 4 speakers. They will speak within the time frame they have been given. They know what the time frame is. After that, there will be 1 question from Henrik and me to each of them, and then we open the floor. When we come to the session about question and answers, there are 3 words you have to remember. The first is question, the second is comment, and the third is short. If you decide to put forward a question, we ask you to be precise. If you go for the second word, which was comment, we kindly ask you to remember the third word, which was short. So this is the procedure. Now we will hand over the word to Jens Weinrich. Many of you know him. There is a short description of him in the program. Otherwise, feel free to introduce yourself.
Does it work? Oops. First time in my life I look a little bit, feel a little bit strange. So, does it work? Yes. I'm actually writing a book. Some of you may have seen it out there. I got some graphics there. The Sheikh Ahmad of Kuwait, a big fan and supporter of Thomas Bach, the new IOC president. I'm still in a working process. I hope to be finished in 2 weeks' time from now. I don't know. Partly, a few graphics I present you now will be published in my book as well. But most things I will publish, so to say, exclusively in the book. And for those of you, I can probably say something in the next few minutes, what is of interest for you, for those of you, and if you are able to read German, I can just recommend you to buy the book. So end of ad. The topic is Macht, Moneten, Marionetten. That's the topic in German. Macht, power, money, and marionettes, puppet players, the shift of Olympic power. So how can I use this? I never did it. Zack. Okay. I will be very brief. A few points. The system, the shift, key players, power holders, superpowers, and a few remarks. I was not asked, I was ordered by the bosses, by the big bosses of Play the Game to give you a few thoughts about journalism as well. So the system. I start with the system. This is quite difficult for a quick view, but I mean, this is something we consider as the extended Olympic system, so to say. We got in the middle of all, we got the IOC, owner of the Olympic Games and the symbols. We got the Olympic Charter. The problem with the Charter is, or I don't know, it's not a problem for the IOC. The Charter does not contain the word corruption. So we can ask why, probably because there's no corruption in the Olympic movement. I don't know why. So, but that can be the case. We have the NOCs. There's always a discussion if there are 205 or 204. The IOC says now 204. I don't know. Probably they took out India because India suspended. I don't know. It doesn't matter. We have the 35 international federations, and all of them are always dealing with 3 or 4 Olympic organizing committees. Right now, they are dealing with 4. We have Youth Olympic Games since a few years. And we got, this is probably a little bit too small, we got this special association which will become much more important in the next years, called Sportakkord, Association of All International Sport Federations. I think 91 different sports and plus 10 more federations, more than 100 federations. That is the so-called Olympic system. I took out WADA and some others, and I just gave the dollar signs for saying that this is the money from public sectors and from sponsors. So, and this system works almost without transparency and almost without control. The shift. There have been some main decisions since last year, in the year 2012 and 2013. I say probably some of the decisions were not really elections because power was just shifted. I give you some examples. But nevertheless, it's very important to consider the new power holders, and the winners of all these decisions. We have, first of all, we have ANOC. ANOC is the Association of National Olympic Committees. As you have seen before, 204. So we have one president. Are you still president? Yes, we have one president in the room here, an old friend of Play the Game, and one of the organizers of the Olympic Congress 2009, actually in Copenhagen. So ANOC president became the president in early 2012, Sheikh Ahmad Al-Sabah from Kuwait. So the second important decision was made in May this year in St. Petersburg, Russia, Sportakkord, again the Association of All International Sports Federation. The new president on the left you see, and you will see our friend Sheikh Al-Sabah as well. The new president is Marius Witzer. In English you would probably say Weiser. It doesn't matter. Marius Witzer, born in Romania, actual citizen of Austria, living in Vienna. If you Google or if you read an article just recently written by Rajaratnam, you will find a lot of interesting details about his life. Gambling, some allegations of corruption and serious crime. Of course, Mr. Weiser is always saying, okay, listen, I'm not convicted. I'm totally clear. There's nothing to say anymore. Mr. Weiser is also, a few years ago, he became president of the World Federation, International Federation of Judo. Judo is very important because, I come to this later, because judo is the sport Vladimir Putin has done. He has this 10th dan. He has this black belt and is a lover of judo. And he also supported Marius Witzer to become the president of the International Judo Federation. At this time, there was a bloody fight going on against the incumbent from South Korea, the former IOC member Park On-young, and Witzer was able to succeed. So, and then we have had the most important election just recently. You see on the right again, our friend the Sheikh. Thomas Bach succeeded to become the IOC president on September the 10th in Buenos Aires. So, plus, I mean, I'm just talking shortly about the decision for positions, plus I take one of the statistics Søren Bang has presented yesterday, plus we have to consider the shift in terms of mega events, the shift over the past few years, the important shift in hosting events, not only mega events, also big world championships and everything. You know what happened? Qatar 2022, the World Cup in football, Russia 2018, and when we got the Olympics, we talked a whole day about the Olympics and the World Cup in Brazil. A lot of the mega events went to BRICS states, and Russia also in Sochi and the World Cup in 2018. I did another analysis I counted all World Championships in the Olympic sports since 1980. How many years are that? More than until 22, more than 40 years, and I used a special point system. Just one example for a daily event where you just need one day and one ordinary sports hall, I gave 1 point, and for the Summer Olympics I gave 35 points. You can say it's just a game to do that, but I wanted to create something like a point system. It's not a surprise that the US have always been number one in the 80s, 90s, and in the early years, from 2000, 2009. And Germany has been number two, and you will hardly find Brazil. Yeah, you can find Brazil here. Of course, you cannot find Qatar yet. But if you look only at the ranking from 2010 to 22, of course, and that's according to the statistics Søren has presented, of course, we have considered a lot of changes, and the US, for instance, and Germany. Oh, I'm sorry, that is still in German. US and Germany went down extremely. So this is all connected, of course, the power shift in hosting events and the shift in the positions in the big international sport federations. Some of the key players, just briefly, and I will only talk about the last IOC elections in September now. The old president, the new president. If you are interested, I have given a prediction on my blog, and I was wrong with some of the names, but at the end, in terms of the number Bach has gotten, 49, I think, I was totally right. I got two lists. One was generally regarded as certain votes for Bach, and I think I came to 36. And the other list was potential votes, swinging votes. And if I count half of the swinging votes, because of course for him or against him, so I have to count 36 36 plus 13, and then I come to 49 votes. And probably 3 or 4 names are not right, but if you are interested in, you can check it, where he got his votes from. So some of the key members, I consider key members after talking to, I don't know, 30 to 40 IF presidents, IOC members this year, asking all more or less same questions. And one question was always regarding the power holders. And the question was, how influential can a key member be? We were talking, many years we were talking about the unbelievable power of people like Kim Un-yong, the former IOC member from Korea, or Samaranch. I mean, they always have worked together, and they had put their forces together in most elections. And there we were talking about a number of votes, let's say 30 to 35. This was the famous Samaranch package. Today, if people are talking about key members, they are talking about maybe 3 to 5 votes, maybe less. And that is common, according to my, I wouldn't say investigation, talks to many, many people with the power to vote. According to them, maybe 2, 3, maybe 5 votes. That is, people who are able to do this are considered to be a key member. John Coates from Australia is one, very important for Thomas Bach to become the president, extremely important. He was elected, I think, in 2010 as CAS president of Court of Arbitration for Sport. He was supported, of course, by Bach against Dick Pounder this time. He became, in Buenos Aires, he became the IOC vice president, and just recently, 2 weeks ago or so, Bach made him the head of the 2020 Tokyo Coordination Commission. And he has been the CEO, I think, CEO, he was in Sydney 2000. Interesting, if we are talking about Court of Arbitration for Sport, and if we are talking about transparency and all these things. Remember, when Sydney has won the games in '93, there was a session held in Monte Carlo, Monaco, and there was a race between Sydney and Beijing. And the Australian, they got the information one night before that Beijing is going to win. What did John Coates do? Together with Rod McGach, they went in a restaurant and they invited 2 African members, and they made, after midnight, they made contracts with 2 African members. I think the number of US dollars was 50,000 or so, and the $50,000 were supposed to go donated to the foundations of the 2 African IOC members. I think in Africa they are still looking for it. Everything what I'm saying about this donation is well documented. It came out during the Salt Lake City scandal when some journalists in Australia also did their investigation, and everything is documented. There was even an investigation commission in Australia. You can find everything on the web or in certain books. So Pat Hickey, Ireland, Bach supporter, president of the European Olympic Committee, just announced I think the honorary president of Marius Weiser's Judo Federation, and right now organizing in Baku, Azerbaijan, the first European Games. Nobody knows why we need in Europe European Games. Niels, can you tell us later on? I don't know. I don't know why. What people are telling me is it costs probably around 1 billion euro. We don't know. So Lambis Nicolaou from Greece, he would like it if he would hear that I consider him to be a key member. He is the one who has best contacts to the royals. And if he was able or not, I don't know, but people consider him to have contacts and working for Thomas Bach. One of the backgrounds is this guy has studied in Munich many years ago. Sam Ramzani, South Africa, I always consider him to be the international relations manager of the German NOC in Africa. He is married with East German women, and even the families, Bach families, Ramzani families, they are always together. And I would guess if, and then in the next years, 24, 28, or 32, during the presidency of Thomas Bach, if Olympic Games will be awarded to Africa, they will go to South Africa. There's no other place. Laminiak, you know him, International Athletics Federation president, also very important for Thomas Bach, and Prince Takeda from Japan, just shortly. So far the key members, now the power holders, this one, of course. If you ask how many votes is this guy able to deliver, of course I don't know. People saying maybe 10, maybe 12, maybe less, I don't know. But again, definitely not 30 or something, impossible. So just a few positions for those of you who are not so familiar with him. He is the president of ANOC, I told you before, the Association of National Olympic Committees. He is very important and influential in the Asian Football Federation, and he made the Bahraini, what is his name again, Sheikh Salman. He made him the president in May as well, again in a bloody fight in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He made Marius Weiser president of Sport Accord. If you want to see the pictures and everything, okay, I have to hurry, I'm sorry. Handball, we heard about him yesterday by Christa Aal. Even his right hand, his Zadlatus, Hussein Al-Musallam, even this guy is vice president of FINA. He is doing everything for the Sheikh. He has done business with Thomas Bach. Kuwait is the biggest investor in a company. Thomas Bach is the head of the board of directors. Then he was a former OPEC president. A lot of corruption allegations, just a note, in Kuwait about him. Even in Kuwait, they consider Sheikh Ahmad as very corrupt. And even one of his former right hand, before Al-Mutaleb, even he got millions from ISL company. I must show only this for a few seconds, because whenever I was coming to play the game since 2002, I was talking about ISL. So at least I have to give you this short version. Even, and we have also again the connection, the Sheikh and his former aide getting millions, well documented, on court documented, from ISL. The ISL founder, shortly, this guy, you know him, Horst Dassler, you know this guy here on the right, is our new IOC president from Germany. He has served in Adidas as Horst Dassler's Adler's right hand from 85 to 87. Many people in IOC get to know him as Mr. Adidas, as the right hand of Thomas Bachler. Right now, of course, Thomas Bach is saying, "Oh, I was there just three months more or less. I have worked with Horst Dassler." There was nothing at all. But in fact, he got his sport political education in Adidas by Horst Dassler. No question at all. For juridical reason, I have to say again, Thomas Bach had never any knowledge about the system, about bribery systems created by Horst Dassler in ISL and Adidas. Some last remarks. Superpowers. I think we need to have several steps, and I talked about key players, power holders, superpowers. Now it comes not only anymore to countries, but to persons, to officials. We are coming to countries. I see right now two superpowers in international sport. It's not rocket science. You have Qatar, you have Russia, and both countries have not only huge amount of monies, we never heard about it before, investing in sport and sport-related projects. Both countries have a plan, projects, ideas. Sport is an integrated part. If you compare it with Sheikh Al-Sabah, it's his personal thing. Playing field, something like this. James knows it much better probably, and he will talk about Qatar later. But these countries, they have a plan. So Qatar, you know this, the many world championships in Qatar. You know the many sports clubs, football clubs, they are going to buy sponsorship and everything. I just gave you a few. It's important to have at least an overview, and you have to consider some of the most important organizations connected with this big plan, Qatar, the National Vision Qatar 2030. Russia is I think a little bit more complicated. And that it's also just an overview that is extremely, extremely interesting. And you have a lot of more information if you compare Russia and Qatar. Of course, you have a lot of more information about Russia. You can write books and books and books about it. Just a few lines, and then I will be finished. Vladimir Putin, of course, is the head of all. I mean, there's nothing going on in Russia on a certain level without his ukaz or without his yes, without his allowance. Gazprom, state-owned Gazprom, is the main company. There are others as well. Gazprom is the main company. You know that. Gazprom is also the sponsor of European Champions League, just recently became FIFA sponsor. And a lot of Gazprom managers have positions in international sport as well. Russia has 4 IOC members now, 2 former KGB agents, Vitaly Smirnov and Chamil Tarpishev. We have Alexander Popov, the former athlete, and we have now Zhukov, the NOC president and former minister. They have a lot of IF presidents. I just give you two examples. Alisher Usmanov, actually the richest Russian according to Forbes list. Usmanov is president of International Fencing Federation, and there's also a connection, of course, to Gazprom. And he is, since many years, he is CEO of Gazprom Invest Holding, investing dozens of billions of dollars. Marius Fizer again. Other oligarchs connected with Sochi, for instance, Deripaska, Potanin, and then it comes to the friends of Vladimir Putin. Just one example, Rottenberg. There are Rottenberg brothers. One of the younger one is Boris. I mean, I think he has, according to Forbes, 1.2 billion right now, and the other one is Arkady, and he is worth 3-point-something billion. What is important for us now, they have a lot of sport clubs and everything. Just recently, yesterday, there was an announcement in Finland about the Continental Hockey League. What is important for us is Rottenberg got contracts in Sochi, I think 22 or 21 contracts in an amount of 7.5 billion US. And according to Boris Nemtsov, you have to read his analysis about the corruption during the Sochi Games preparations. According to Nemtsov, there's a corruption margin up to 50%. If that would be true, then Rottenberg would gain, let's say, a few billion US. What is he doing with it in sport, for instance? Fizer in Sportakkord has one plan. One of his plans is to establish a World Bank of Sport. He also wants to establish a World Lottery of Sports and something more. And Rottenberg, the judo buddy of Vladimir Putin, is doing the business in Sportakkord with Fizer together. Yeah. So I don't like to talk about journalism. Huh? We can do it later if you want. Okay.
Fine for me. Thank you, Jens Weinreich. I will not try to conclude on the presentation, just say that I have a feeling that you touched upon more challenges than solutions. We will head on to the next one, James Dorsey. And by the way, I'm over here for your signals.
Thank you. I apologize to those who were this morning at the ICSSP session. The first bit of what I have to say is going to be a bit of a repetition of that. Jens, in many ways, paved the way for me in illustrating what I think is a key point and what has been the elephant in the room over the last 4 days in terms of discussions that we've had about reform, about accountability, about transparency. And Tolga Şenol, in his presentation on Turkish soccer, illustrated it very much in much the same way as Jens did when he described the political associations in terms of sponsorship and other things between sports, and particularly between football and politics in Turkey. Fact of the matter is, as far as I'm concerned, the separation of politics and sports is a fiction. In fact, I would argue that sports and politics are joined at the hip. And the sooner we bury this fiction and recognize this as a fact and put it on the table, the sooner we would be able to start discussing ways of how we regulate, create a code of conduct, whatever form of governance that will then open the door to a lot of the problems that I think are intertwined in sports. I would argue that if the Middle East and North Africa is not the prime example of that inextricable relationship between politics and sports, much in the way in which you described the role of Sheikh Ahmad Al-Sabah, it certainly is one of the foremost examples. And Sheikh Salman, whom Jens mentioned, was elected earlier this year as the president of the Asian Football Confederation to fill the term, that period of the term that was left over after Mohammed bin Hammam had been dismissed. There was nothing wrong with his election, but indeed, he came to power by virtue of the fact that Kuwait had the muscle to not only persuade a whole host of nations that may have been easier persuadable, but he's probably one of the very few people who's been able to twist the arm of the Chinese, who withdrew their candidate. It does raise, however, or his election does raise, however, the issue of that relationship between politics and sports. Sheikh Salman is a man who is head of the Bahrain Football Federation Association. He is a member of the ruling family of Bahrain. His office stands accused, but to be fair, there is no evidence for that. His office stands accused of having fingered 150 athletes, sports executives, and others who were arrested or dismissed from their jobs because of because they allegedly had participated in the popular uprising in Bahrain in 2011 that was brutally squashed. However, to the credit of the Bahraini government, it did actually initiate an independent investigation of the way that revolt was squashed. And the result was that there was torture, that there was police brutality. 3 of those people who were brutalized, they were denounced on television as traitors, they were arrested, they were tortured, and in one case, sentenced to prison, although that prison sentence was never implemented under pressure from FIFA, were 3 of the country's national football team players. If you ask Sheikh Salman about any of this, he will tell you the separation of sports and politics begins at the entrance to the offices of the Bahrain Football Association. No less could be the truth. We can go through, and I've done that this morning, and I'm not going to go that in greater detail, of example after example of how politics and sports, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, is intertwined. There's one example that I do want to spend some time on, and that is Qatar. I should warn you, if anybody were to track my journalistic record, and they would go back to the beginning of my journalistic career, they would probably leave the room now because you would conclude that my predictions are totally wrong. When I first visited the Gulf in the early 1970s, I walked away and wrote, "These states cannot survive. They're not sustainable. They're not viable." Well, we're 40 years later, and they're still there. However, if you also go back to that period, you would note that one of the first pieces I wrote on the Gulf was to describe Gulf states as apartheid states. And it was a reference to their treatment of foreign labor, and it was a reference to their treatment of Bedouins who are nationals but not recognized as citizens. And I've written frequently about that labor situation since. The article in The Guardian recently was a great piece of investigative journalism, but we all knew about it. The issue of foreign labor, you can probably fill libraries with the number of reports by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by whatever. Nobody ever paid any attention till now. Which leads me to what I think will be maybe a statement for which I will be thrown out of this room, but I really think that despite all the problems that there are with Qatar, labor problems, human rights problems, transparency problems, the country's an autocracy, no question about it. It recently sentenced a poet to prison for a poem. But having said all of that, I still would argue that discussion, and a lot of the discussion as is implicitly been here over the last 4 days, is partially motivated by external agendas, by envy, by sour grapes, by arrogance, and by prejudice. If you look at the facts on the ground, first of all, one has to understand, and this goes back to my point about sports and politics, why is Qatar doing this? It's a very simple cost-benefit analysis. We heard from Bonita earlier this week about the Australian bid. And the Australians, for what they wanted to achieve out of bidding for the World Cup and possibly winning the bid, in terms of country branding, in terms of what other leveraging they wanted, that was worth $45 million to them. It's a subjective figure, but that was what it was worth to them. They could have put $200 million on the table if they'd wanted to. That bid wasn't just worth it to them, because in relationship to what they were trying to achieve. For Qatar, this is not about country branding. This is not about leveraging business opportunities or whatever. Sure, those are all secondary advantages, but they're not worth the money that Qatar's putting on the table for this. What is worth the money is Qatar learned a lesson in 1990. It actually learned two lessons in 1990. The first lesson was when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, that Kuwait was able to marshal the international community to come to its aid. The second lesson they learned was that the Saudi defense umbrella, which they had at the time, wasn't worth the ink on the paper in which it was written. The Saudis could not defend themselves, let alone defend Qatar. This is leaving the Qatari-Saudi relationship aside. They since have an American defense umbrella. And while that defense umbrella is there, they're never really sure whether if and when a day comes that they need it, it really will be there. They can buy whatever weapons they want. They can hire as many Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, whoever, to fill the rank and file of their armed forces. Iraq or whoever else it would be would probably roll over them quicker than they rolled over Kuwait. The only thing they have in terms of defense and security is soft power. And what better tool than the most popular form of popular culture in the world, football, and then all the other sports. So the cost-benefit analysis that is involved in this, and the reason why you're doing this, is a very different calculation from any other bidder for a sports mega event. I would also argue that they're doing this in a much more structural fashion than the only other comparable states to them, which is Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. Bahrain sponsors the F1. The UAE does tennis tournaments, tries to attract some international federations to set up headquarters in Abu Dhabi. For whatever it's worth, the Qataris, one, see sports as part of the national identity they are trying to develop. And two, most of us come from countries where the sports industry, the whole sports sector, is an organically grown sector. They're building it A to Z. From one day to figuratively from one day to the other. So what I'm trying to say with this, one is what better link between sports and politics, but also in looking at this bid, you've got to understand what this bid is about. There's no question that labor conditions in Qatar are onerous. But I would also suggest that one looks at two things. And mind you, the Qataris are their own worst enemy. They will not tell you any of this. look at what has happened in the what is now two and a half years since the World Cup has been awarded to Qatar, and look at what are the underlying issues that you're confronting when you talk about the labor issue. The labor issue has three elements, as far as I'm concerned, with regard to the Qataris. One is the material labor, material living and working conditions. If you looked at Qatari labor regulations and laws, and we'll come to the kafala system in a second, they're actually not all that bad in terms of, and there have been significant improvements in the last 2 years, to the degree that there are Gulf investors today who will no longer invest in Qatar because the labor regulations are too tough for them. More importantly, if you look, and I find much the charters that have been developed in the last year or year and a half with regard to workers' rights, more important than the charter of the Supreme 2022 Committee is the charter of the Qatar Foundation. And not only is that charter more important, as far as I'm concerned, what they're doing with that charter is more important. If you look at the, thank you. If you look at the migration cycle, the migration cycle is recruitment in the home country, the transport to Doha or to Qatar, the actual period that the worker is in Qatar, and the exit. One of the most onerous parts of that cycle is the recruitment. By the time that worker arrives in Qatar, he's indebted for years to come. On average, a human resource manager of the company that is hiring him gets $500 to $600 kickback per worker. The key principle in the Qatar Foundation's charter is a worker shall not pay for his recruitment. Nice words. What are you going to do about it? The foundation actually is looking at what to do about it. They've sent delegations to Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka, to various other countries. And they have three options. To the best of my knowledge, they haven't decided which option they're going to choose. But the three options are, you can cut out the middlemen totally, set up your own recruitment system and do it yourself. You can work with government employment agencies. The problem with that is that many of them are corrupt. Or you devise some formula in cooperation with what are termed ethical recruitment agencies. Whatever they do, what it tells me is that there is a serious effort to change this. Now, the serious effort to change this has both positive and negative sides to it, if you wish. The positive side is they're trying to change. And frankly, in my mind, without the World Cup being awarded, this would not have happened. Just to sidetrack for 1 second, and this goes to my second and third point, what this has also done has sparked discussion not in Qatar in terms of the status of a foreign community. And keep in mind, when we're talking about a foreign community, Qataris are at best 10 to 15% of the population. They are at best 6% of the workforce. With other words, anywhere up from 85% is non-Qatari. 94% of the workforce is non-Qatari. In the United Arab Emirates, it sparked a few very brave people, like Sultan al-Qasimi, a member of the ruling family in Sharjah, to raise the question of citizenship. It's, in that part of the world, revolutionary and would not have happened without the World Cup. The key point here is that in discussing labor rights, if you want to change labor rights, and I'll end in a second, if you want to change labor rights in Sochi, in Russia, it's a question of political pressure probably. You achieve that change of labor rights, the fundamental nature of Russia will not change. The fundamental political structure of that country will not change. If you do it in Qatar, you're talking about, from a Qatari perspective, giving people a stake in a society. They know that this demography is not viable. It's not sustainable. But there is no emotion, no human emotion that is more irrational than fear. And this is about fear of existentialism and not knowing how to deal with it. And so, yes, the reforms are necessary. Yes, a lot of change is necessary. Yes, this is an autocratic state. But unless you understand what you're dealing with, you're not going to achieve it. Thank you.
Now I have to consider my words carefully, because it was my intention to say that we are now entering to a person representing the knowledge sector. But I will add, we are going to another knowledge sector, from 2 journalists to a professor. Please welcome Margaret Talbot.
Thank you. I am a professor, but I'm all right, really. So, okay. I'm going to be as quick as I possibly can. Just to say very quickly, this is ICSPE's mission. Those of you who are interested can look at this on the website. But just to say, we're not just a bunch of nerds who talk and contemplate our navels. We are trying actually to do something, which is, I think, great fun. But we are an active organization. And we have some strategic priorities. They're big, big priorities. And some of them are more progressed than others because of the element of leadership which has driven those priorities, but also opportunity. So quality physical education is much further ahead than the other 2, but we're making progress on those too. Physical education, the challenges of physical education, this is our position statement, so we define our terms. Again, if you're interested in the definition, you can read it. But I do want to just highlight the fact that it's not sport, it's not physical activity, it is a systematic pedagogical enterprise which is supposed to be inclusive and which helps children move efficiently, effectively, and safely, and understand what they are doing, the outcome of physical literacy. And that's why it's special. Challenges for physical education. The first big challenge is to articulate its unique contribution. Physical education has not done that very well, especially to parents. Children actually quite like physical education until they get to halfway through high school. That's a generalization. But in general, they quite like it. And one study said, my favorite subject. So there are a few myths about whether children benefit from physical education. Girls and women need physical education more than boys and men because they are more dependent upon it to learn the physical skills, confidence, and understanding they need for participation in physical activity and sport. Another challenge is to secure a sustainable place within curriculum time. It's a big, big issue. It's been losing ground over the last 3 decades. But there are some encouraging signs that in some countries there's a recognition that it's coming back. These overlapping, often conflicting policy expectations are a real issue for physical education. It has to meet educational criteria to to deserve a place on the curriculum. Otherwise, why should it have a place on the curriculum? But we haven't been very good at that within the profession. We've been too good at dancing to other people's tunes. And sometimes those tunes are sporting tunes, sometimes they're health tunes. And I'll come back to that, because the evidence of our contribution in those three areas is desperately needed. Huge, huge challenges. Challenges of physical education to the rest of the policy landscape. I do think that there is a role as moral guardian, respect for one's own and other people's bodies and contributions. That's a really fundamental piece of social education, which no one else in the school curriculum can convey. And I think also there's a need for a cultural change in sport from talent identification towards retaining participation and talent development. And physical education pedagogy helps to support that, from hothousing and overexposure to competition towards age-appropriate learning. And lots of federations are now adopting that model. For me, teaching and coaching are closer together than they have ever been in my professional life, and that's welcome. Technology transfer between teachers and coaches is desirable. The technical knowledge of coaches and the knowledge of children's development and pedagogy from the teachers. That's rich. A common shared pedagogy, that's what we should be aiming at. Huge challenge, but worthwhile. And the International Council for Coaching Excellence has just published a framework for coaching which underlies a lot of this cultural shift. But we have these colliding worlds of physical education and professional sport. We know this. First 2 days of this conference, I sat there thinking, well, since everybody accepts the normalized behavior of professional fouls, etc., how does that leave the physical education teacher with small children who are learning moral codes around sport and through sport and competitive activity? And the question I have, should physical education teachers abandon even trying to teach right from wrong? I think that's a big question for the whole of sport to answer. Because if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Okay, let's move on to science, because I was given both to do. You know, easy peasy. Science function: to observe, listen, analyze, question, and inform. And I love this quotation from Martin Luther King. It's so, so right. And it says quite a lot about what has just been discussed about the way in which incestuous organizations reproduce in their own images, because that's what you've all been talking about for days. It's surprising how many people find it difficult to think about what they know best and value most. It's uncomfortable. Now, the Kirkeby position is very clear. Science in the service of sport, which is ethical and inclusive. Inclusive. Just look round this room. Look round the room at the beginning of the conference. Even the discussion of a critical symposium like Play the Game is by no means inclusive. And neither have the topics been. Poor old Jens has had my ranting about it over the last couple of days. So Kirkeby has a position, and I say that ungrounded knowledge is dangerous. Knowledge without a grounding, knowledge without knowing where you're coming from, is dangerous. And I'm a great fan of Karl Popper in terms of what science is about. It's about myth-busting. And that's what science can do. It can challenge. Sport's full of myths based on stereotypes. Women don't like sport. Men don't like to dance. All sorts of silly stereotypes based on normative assumptions. And some of those normative assumptions become rules in sport. And I'll illustrate that. So science and advocacy together can do quite a lot. I hope you like the cartoon. I love it. We have so many double standards in sport. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but that last bullet point, this was the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport. Their motto is, ask why and change it. Yeah, that's what we should be doing. Here's a good example. The women athletes and the international federations. These idiots in international boxing who said that the girls had to wear skirts because they wanted to present a feminine image to the media. For boxing, what's it got to do with femininity or masculinity? It's to do with technical competence and athleticism and all of those things. And the women revolted. They wouldn't do it. So the IF had to back down. It was about choice. Volleyball, the only international federation which has ever, in my experience and knowledge, legislated in its rules that the uniform had a maximum coverage of 2 centimetres at the hip level. And it went on for years. Thank God for the London climate, because actually it allowed women to wear sensible clothing. But if you contrast the uniforms, I was told, well, it's functional to wear those. And I said, well, why don't the men wear them then? How did we allow it to get away with that for so long? And the same happened with badminton, you know, this thing about skirts. And again, the women athletes said, no, I'm not comfortable wearing skirts. I want to wear shorts. It's functional. And, you know, we need to look at these challenges to both cultures and normalized practices. Here's Kathy Freeman wearing something which is very similar to the Bahraini athlete here, but for totally different reasons. And yet, who gets stigmatized? The Bahraini athlete. 1/3 of the world's population is Muslim. Sport hasn't got caught up with that yet. Anomalies, another problem, and I'm not going to spend a lot of the time, but the point is that anomalies point out that rules and the law are because they're normative. And here's a great example. Synchronized swimming excludes male competitors. Now, it was set up as a female activity. And one of my female friends once said, well, it's a plot to keep women in their place. But actually, it's an incredibly difficult activity, technically and in terms of stamina. But you can understand the culture from which she was speaking. But why shouldn't this young man be a synchronized swimmer? What on earth are we doing here? And I think it's because we allow ourselves to be dominated by dominant paradigms. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on paradigm, but you know, the reproduction of paradigms is actually quite an important element to consider in organizational development, rule structures in particular, in international sport, particularly if you're talking about fair play. Paradigm or myth? Myth busting. We're back to this. The greatest barrier to a paradigm shift is the reality of paradigm paralysis. We're stuck in it, so we can't see beyond it. It's always been like this. And shifts are scary. Takes people outside their comfort zone. No doubt about that. It's a big problem. If sport does exclude all these people, why is it their behavior who has to change, and not the behavior of sport institutions? What on earth are we doing to children when we're imposing adult models on little children? And we see it every day on the park. And parents are quite often the worst exponents, especially fathers. Another example of paradigm is talent, and I'm not going to spend time on that. You'll be able to look at the slides if you want to. So I think we need a fresh look at sports science. That's a challenge and perhaps a solution. So, you know, whether you're a practitioner or a researcher or a policymaker or whatever, we need to look at how science serves sport and to value the way in which serves its sports and the way in which it goes on. And the last thing, knowledge is power, but wisdom comes from the understanding of how to use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret Talbot. Now we go from 3 representatives from 2 different knowledge sectors to a doer. Niels Nygaard is from a National Olympic Committee and Sport Confederation, so he is a doer in the political world, but also as the political leader of a governing body. Please, Niels.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having the opportunity to come here today to give some opinions from an NOC president. Also, thank you to all of you for having spent 4 days here in Aarhus, here in Denmark, discussing a number of very important issues. As you will hear from my speech, I disagree with probably most of you in this room about global sport and the situation of global sport. But I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in dialogue. I believe that it's important that we have these discussions. And of course, as I will also explain, there are a number of things who could be and should be much better in global sport. I have not been able to be here for the first couple of days during the conference because I was in Baku in Azerbaijan. I'm on the Coordination Commission for European Games 2015. I was there together with my colleague, the NOC president of Azerbaijan, who is also the president of Azerbaijan, who a few weeks ago was re-elected as president with 86% of the votes. And the result of the election was announced a couple of hours before the votes actually were counted. So this is my colleague in Azerbaijan. My view on global sports is overall very positive. I think there are a lot of very positive things to say about global sports. Global sport has a very high interest. A lot of people are following sport all over the world. Sport creates a lot of friendships. It creates or gives peace in certain areas in the world. I think sport is about the only activity where United Nations is able to, during the Olympics, to make truce, so no wars going on during the Olympic Games. We see people that normally are adversaries, that are usually fighting each other, shooting at each other. They can be in the same stadium, they can even be on the same podium, they can even embrace each other. So there are many positive things. Many people in the world do sport. Sport is good for health. Sport is good for integration. But there are also a number of things which is not so very good. One thing about global sport, if we look at it, is that the way people have a chance to do sport throughout the world is very different. Just like wealth is distributed very unequal throughout the world, then the chance to do sport is also distributed unequally, and a lot of things should be done about that. We also have a number of evils. We have corruption, we have lack of transparency, we have doping, we have match fixing. These are problems, and these are problems that we should do something about. Coming from a country, Denmark, where we mostly have, or you have even more positive things to say about sport, because we don't have so many of the global problems that I described before. In Denmark, 64% of the population is doing sport regularly, which is one of the highest percentages of the world. And even more important, 42% of the Danish population do sport in clubs, which means they are doing sport together in an environment where they care for each other. Also in Denmark, we are so lucky and so maybe also clever that we do get a lot of medals for the Danish athletes. Compared to the size of our country, we are one of the countries in the world where we make the most medals. So we have a lot of good things going on in Denmark. So why then should we, as Danes, as National Olympic Committee and Sports Confederation of Denmark, care so much about what's going on in the rest of the world, since we are doing fine here and we could concentrate on that? There are two main reasons why we believe it's very important to try and do what we can do to influence global sport. The one thing is that we want to win medals. We want to take part in international sport. And in order to affect the rules of international sport, affect what are the events that should be taking place, what are the rules that the sport should be conducted with. If we want to influence that, we have to be there. We have to try and do something in the international sports organizations. Also, especially in the European Union, more and more rules are being made in Brussels that also affect our chance and our possibilities to do sport in Denmark. So also therefore it's important internationally to try and influence what's going on. Then the other important thing, which is probably the arguments that in this hall you believe is more important, is that we want to promote some values. We want to promote the values that Denmark, that the Nordic countries stand for, about democracy, about transparency, about the way international organizations are being run. But we want to do it in a way which is the only realistic way to actually make some changes. This is by going into these international organizations to try and convince our colleagues to try to be part of these discussions, so that way we can make some changes in global sport. Of course, it's important to have play the game. It's important to have conferences like this. It's important to have critical journalists and so on to make all of us aware about these problems. But the only ones who can really do something about it and really make some changes is the international organizations, where we have to seek influence and where we have to try and make the changes from within. In our world, it's the International Olympic Committee, it's the European Olympic Committees, it's the European and the international federations in the Olympic sports and the non-Olympic sports. And it is our aim from the Danish NOC to try and be present in as many of these fora as possible and to try to influence the direction of things. Today we announced, Paul Moberg at one of the sessions, a survey we have made about power index of all the countries in the world in these international organizations. Today, Denmark has 26 positions in the most important fora throughout the world. This is quite many compared to the size of our country, but we would like to have even more representatives. And even more importantly, we want to have representatives who are able to do something, who has knowledge and the competences to actually go in and do something about those issues that I have mentioned. How do we get influence in these international fora? Like I said before, we don't believe that we can influence those fora a lot by standing on a big chair and shouting about all the problems. We don't believe that we can do it by making a lot of criticism all the time. We believe that we have to understand all the other countries that we are working together with. We have a situation where if we look at the 204 countries that are members of the International Olympic Committee, there are maybe about 20 of those countries that share our values. Even the Southern European, the Eastern European countries, in many ways, they don't share the same values as far as transparency, as far as democracy, and so on. So it's a long struggle to be able to influence that. But we believe that by going into these talks, by trying to be there, we will, in the long run, not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but in the long run, be able to make those changes come through. So this is our way of trying to meet the challenges, and we believe in the long run it is the only way really to make a better global sport, a better global sport that you want, and of course that we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Niels Nygaard. And now I will be accompanied by another journalist, also director of Henrik Brandt. And we will pose the first question to the four speakers, and then you are all invited to get ready for your questions, your comments. And remember, there were 3 words: question, be precise; comment, be short. Thank you.
Yes, the first question goes to Jens Weinrich, because you showed us this picture of Al-Sabah and Bach and Vita as 3 leaders who are kind of connected and put in somewhere. And what are they up to? You sort of say that it's Russia and Qatar. You see them as the new superpowers. Is that a bad thing? Niels has just been, I could understand, in Baku, and he thought it was he was with that president, that it was not a democratic system, but obviously they invest in sport. Is it a bad thing that these guys are more and more taking over from the other guys who was in control before? Are you just angry because it's not the German Dassler that controls it anymore? Or what is your take on this?
Not necessarily. I mean, as long as it sounds like a dream, as long as it is transparent, so would be nice. But it is not, definitely not in Russia. We have to see. I mean, just give you one example. It's quite similar to the example Niels has given us when he was quoting the president from Azerbaijan, his colleague. At Sport Accord elections, so-called elections, I don't know, in St. Petersburg, Al-Musallam, the right hand of the Sheikh, and he was telling guys the night before on the bar in the hotel, and I was there on the bar. It's always important to be at the bar the night before, and he was telling them the result. So, and I remember I would like to have been there. Andrew, if he is somewhere in the room, he was once at one congress of the International Boxing Federation, AIBA, in Antalya, and if I remember right, he has given a guy, a boxing delegate, he has paid 1 or 2 beers to him, and in exchange, Andrew got the results of the election the next day. So as long as it works like this, then we have a problem, yes. But right now, and what I wanted to say, it was very brief, and I'm trying to work it out in a few chapters in my book. Without aggressiveness, you know, I just want to describe, and the system of Putin, for instance, if you try to analyze and gathering some data, then it's very important. Then you can see all over the world in a system like this we never had before. That's my theory. We never had before. It's a powerful system we never had before. Not in the Soviet Union, not in the Cold War. What Putin with his guys has arranged is a system. They can do everything.
Thank you very much. The question for James Dorsey is...
No, sorry. Dorsey wanted to say something.
Yeah,
No,
I just wanted just one remark, and that is, there's another question, which, in addition to which Henrik asked, and that is, should, for example, international sports organizations be pillars of autocratic regimes? That's the counter question.
James, you said that it's a fact sport and politics is very tight connected. You introduced a code of conduct. If you look upon the countries you mentioned in your intervention, do you believe that the code of conduct or code of conduct police is part of the solution?
Well, I think, in a sense, the answer to that goes to the question I just posed. With other words, if you were to simply apply whatever the ideals are of the Olympic Charter, or even more practically, the rules and regulations of FIFA, you would see today more than 50% of the Egyptian Premier League disqualified. With other words, what I'm getting at is that, no, would they voluntarily comply with that? Absolutely not. But international sports organizations, certainly FIFA, certainly the IOC, have a set of standards. And all you really need to start with is adhering to those standards and those rules.
Thank you. Margaret, you are representing a knowledge sector. And my question to you is, do you find that the knowledge is powerful enough when it comes to shaping the future of sport?
That's an awesome responsibility you've given me, by the way. Just one comment about handing over, shifting of power. The guys taking over from the other guys. For me, that excludes half the world's population before we even start. And you've absorbed that. You use the language all the time. Please stop doing that. Going back to your question, the knowledge thing. Knowledge is patchy. We know that, for instance, you said that sport is good for health. Actually, sport can ruin your health. I have an artificial hip from 30 years of field hockey. On the other hand, the consultant said, okay, if you need another one, you'll still be physically active enough to cope with it. Thank you very much. It isn't actually a very good evidence base that if you have a lifelong participation in sport, that you're necessarily healthy. Physical activity keeps you healthy, but competitive sport doesn't necessarily. And the life of competitive sport can be quite short. So I think we've got to be much more precise about the claims that we make and the knowledge we have to support the claims. We certainly don't get enough research and enough investment in research to enable that knowledge base to be extended. And the least well-invested part of research is critical research, without a shadow of doubt. And this is one of our problems. And then lastly, those of us in research, those of us in scholarly activity are absolutely lousy at translating it to other people. And other people are just as bad at listening to it. So we've got to try and make some linguistic and cultural advances and bridges so that we can all use what we have better.
Question for Niels Nygaard. In 1999, I think it was, some of us were at the first World Congress on doping, and after the Tour de France scandal and the Salt Lake City scandal, and the politicians from one country after another came in and shouted democracy, accountability, transparency, and they want a share in the fight against doping because it didn't work, and they founded WADA, and today I think your line would also be we need this cooperation with governments on doping. Yesterday we heard FIFA. They said we need the intervention of governments in match fixing. It's the biggest threat. I know that's a tactic they always use when they're a bit in trouble, but they said it anyway. They divert maybe the attention from their own governance problems to the big world. The evil world is coming at us with match fixing. We need the help. We cannot do this alone. And I also think that it's maybe also your line in that question. But then my question is, or if we should make a bet that maybe in 5 or 10 years, you would say we need the intervention of governments to help our democratic sport movement in Denmark and the 20 other countries that share our values to resist sport becoming pillars of autocratic regimes. Because as we have heard here, as you just experienced in Azerbaijan, it is not the democratic countries that are taking over at the moment. So do you think in 5 or 10 years you will say we need government intervention to ensure that international sport is run in a way where we can still be part of it and stand up for it?
Precise question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Just let him speak in the microphone, it's okay.
First of all, I believe very much in the autonomy of sport. I believe in autonomy on the local level, on autonomy on the national level, and autonomy on the international level. I think there are 2-3 ways where the authorities, the government, can and should take action. One thing is that if the sports organizations do something that are illegal, which is not in compliance with the laws of each country, then of course the government, the authorities, has to intervene. So that is, if you are in a country where there is where corruption is not allowed, then of course the authorities, the government shall intervene and make sure that corruption and other unlawful things does not go on. The other place I think where the government has something to say is that when there is public funding of sport in the clubs, in the national organizations, from EU to European associations and so on, then of course that if you do not comply with what the funds you have been given, if you don't do that in the right way, then of course government has to intervene. The third way I could see the government having a role is to set good examples. Like we have had a very interesting and good project in the EU about good governance, where we now have a set of rules, a set of recommendations for both the national and the international sport bodies. And I think the authorities, government could do even more there.
So that means you don't accept the claims made by Dorsey and Jens and Turkey. We heard it yesterday from Tolgay, that actually the autonomy of sport is an illusion because actually it's the same. It is the governments that run sport in those countries that take over the power in world sport. You don't believe that you don't have a problem with that autonomy of sport when actually most of the countries don't have this.
Of course, I have a problem with that, but except for trying to influence the international sports organization from within to make sure that sport and politics are not intervened, I don't think we can do much about it. Whenever we are talking about trying to make boycotts and not bringing international events to countries that don't have the same set of rules and the same way of thinking as we have. I don't believe this is the way forward. A lot of people thought that China was wrong to have the Olympic Games. I believe it was very right, and I think in 10, 20 years we will see China having had a good development, partly because of the Olympic Games. Some people say we should not go to Sochi because of the rules of homosexuals in Russia. I don't believe we should stay away from Russia because of that. So I think we have to accept that there are different cultures, there are different political systems, and just by being there, just by having them as part of our international cooperation, I believe in the long run we can influence them in the right direction.
So just to sum up, we should accept that, for example, in Azerbaijan, it's the same, the government, the president is the same like the NOC president. You don't have a problem with that?
As long as the NOC president in Azerbaijan is elected democratically, and that's what I've been told, then I don't have a problem with it. We can see in India where the government really tried to intervene and go and make the rules for the Olympic Committee. Actually, the IOC said to India, if you go in this direction, you can no longer be part of the IOC. You can no longer go to the Olympic Games. Then, of course, we can smile a lot about Azerbaijan, about Belarus and other countries where it's actually the Prime Minister or the President being President of the Olympic Committee. In those instances, they have actually had a General Assembly with all the national organizations, federations taking part and electing the President. So formally, they have complied to the IOC rules. Whether they have in practice, I'm not quite sure.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions, primarily comments if they're short. Please.
My name is James Corbett. Question for James Dorsey, just regarding the labour rights issue in Qatar, which has been a very prominent issue. I'd just like to know your views on the level of discourse about it, and particularly the comments of Sharon Burrow, the head of the International Trade Union Congress, who has been very outspoken about a tournament where construction work hasn't actually really started, but at the same time says nothing about Sochi, which is in a few weeks' time, really, where Human Rights Watch have also documented labour abuses. And I'd just be interested to know your views on this this sort of gap.
Just to clarify, just to clarify, you're asking me about the debate, the external debate, rather than the debate within Qatar,
Yeah.
right? Okay. Joe, do you want me to answer directly?
Please.
Sorry. Well, I think it's what I said at the beginning. I find the whole debate about Qatar based on envy, sour grapes. I find it prejudiced, and I find it arrogant. I think the gallery's totally underestimated that when you win an event like this, you gain prestige, you gain leverage, but so do others. And for the first time, well, let me put it this differently. Every time there was a human rights report, a Amnesty International report, it was a bad day for Qatar. You know, you shut the door, and when you woke up the next morning, it was over. With all due respect to human rights organizations, they have moral value. They cannot move bodies. For the first time, Qatar is now confronted by an organization that potentially has 175 million soccer fans as its members in 153 countries. And so if indeed they can convince their member unions, for the first time Qatar is facing a real critic, a critic that can exert pressure. The question I think it's a very fair comment what you made, that they're talking about Qatar, they're not talking about Sochi. And the question is, but the criticism that I would have of the ITUC is that they have to understand the issues that are involved for the gutteries, including the demographic issue, in order to further a resolution of this. Hitting the gutteries simply over the head is not going to do it. To claim that they've had 3 years' time, nothing has changed, is simply not true.
Thank you.
I can go to on the other issues, but they don't relate to labor.
Thank you. Here, and then the third one. Next one is down, back end. Please.
Hi, I'm Karen Jones with Asser Institute, and I have a short comment. No, I just want to say that some of the latter comments that I've heard, I feel that we really underestimate sometimes the power of sport. And when we take these huge events into countries, and we as citizens of various countries support the sport that's put on or the event that's put on in that country, I think we really underestimate the power, impact, and influence that we really are having at all levels of that society, from the political levels to the impacts on the poverty in that country or the race relations in that country. So I think we really need to take into consideration the whole scope of that. And I know some comments earlier this week, and I would say that yes, though that is part of our responsibility when we're going into those countries and we are putting on these types of events.
Thank you. The next question is down there, and I think we can also please Margaret Talbot, having a gender balance, which is very good in the questionnaire. So thank you very much, please.
Just a little comment. Last year, I interviewed Avalanche because he was an Olympic athlete. And in that moment, he said me about the result of the election to the new International Olympic Committee. And he was incorrect for 1 vote. This game was won many years ago.
Thank you. Henrik has a question, and then the next one is up here.
Yeah, it's for Margaret Talbot and maybe for you, the others, because now we've heard this. What is taking over? It is not sport actually that is important for these people. It's the power and the security. But if we actually want to promote sport, participation in sport, and maybe social capital through sport and grassroots sport, a fair allocation of resources between elite sport and grassroots sport, what will happen if, or what is happening if the control of the whole sports system is taken over by countries that actually have more or less other objectives with what they're doing? That's a question for you.
Well, I don't think they are taking over the whole sports system, because they're not taking over local delivery, for instance. And as other people have pointed out in the latter part of this conference, the mega events are actually a very small part of the overall participation in sport. So I think that's the first issue. The second issue is, yes, about power, and the way people hang on to power, and the way in which people define institutions and processes and procedures which actually keep out any new blood from those organizations. It's not just about gender balance. It's also about the interests of people in countries like the UK, which is incredibly multicultural, but we don't see that reflected in our national federations at all. It's really quite poor. And the federations which actually do the best job at grassroots level and in diversifying the player base are those which have the least investment. But that requires leadership commitment. So if you've got people at the top of international organizations and at the top of national organizations who are not committed to diversity and equity, then it's unlikely to change. And the other problem is everything is defined in that way. It's the paradigm problem. I have a T-shirt which I was given years ago, and it just says 52%. And most women know exactly what it means. But most men think it's a performance score. It's not. It's 52% of the world's population are female. And you would never think of it looking at sport. But it's not just about women. It's about the small nations. It's about indigenous populations. It's about people with different cultural backgrounds. We've only got to look around this room to see that. And this room is much more diverse than some sport get-togethers.
So why don't we make a new sports system then? Where these 52% are better represented, since it's obviously not going to change. You don't think there's a need for another structure?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
But it's
where
not
should it come from?
not a new structure, it's a new culture and a commitment to diversity. And that means you change your protocols and your procedures.
Yeah.
But
Jens,
it's
you
not
wanted
likely to happen by the people who are in power right now.
Yeah. Jens, you wanted to follow up?
We have James and then Jens.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
And if I can say, I would like to hear what
No, I
you
just
have
want-
to say about
no, no.
journalism too.
Just a second. We have a comment from James and then Jens, and then you have the question or comment.
No,
Jens, please comment on
I
this.
want to comment first. So, on your remark, for instance, I mean, I think the discussion, I get the impression the discussion is now a little bit too, how can I say, too smooth, too nice. I mean, I would have been able to do this presentation in a totally another way, full of facts, you know. If you say, for instance, there's a tendency to underestimate the impact of the Olympic Games, of the Olympic movement, I totally disagree. I would say there's a tendency to overestimate it. Give you one example. If you look at Beijing, for instance, it's a matter of fact that in the year of the Olympics and then the year after, the numbers of death sentences increased. Just one example. Huh? If you look back in the Olympic history, there was probably in general one Olympics in Seoul, 88, probably really very, very important for the whole society, for whole South Korea. But you will hardly find, we can discuss it, I know we can discuss it all the day, you will hardly find a lot of very impressive examples. Another one, my second remark, I mean, even when I said it would have been easy to discuss it with other facts, with other words. We have to be clear that people, I don't criticize Niels Nygaard. I have a lot of respect for him and I like him personally, everything. And I watched his way and everything, yeah. But of course, if he's talking about the Belarus president, Lukashenko, and the president of Azerbaijan, we are talking about mass murders. We have to be clear. If I didn't mention some names, some of the guys in the Putin system, and I can give. I'm not playing. I mean, it's documented. Some of them are murders, criminals. A lot of them. Okay. So I just want to be clear. I mean, we can be. Hug each other, go out, the world is good, no? But it is not, definitely not.
Yes, Jens, I would like to hear what you were going to say about journalism.
Now we mentioned, there was, Henrik has given a few remarks yesterday, and I totally agree, and we had in the workshop, we had a few thoughts in the journalist workshops of the 3 days. There's a decline. The problem is there's a decline of journalism, of course, and the international federations, there is almost no coverage anymore in many federations. No sustainable coverage. Of course, if it comes to an important IOC meeting, if it comes to an election of an IOC president, yes, there are some hundreds. But not in general. I can tell you, I'm probably the record holder, together with an AP or Reuters guy, of the last 10 years in EXCO meetings in the IOC. So they're sitting 5, 6, at some occasions, maybe only 3 guys at quite important meetings. It's not the meeting coverage, you know exactly what you mean. You have to have some context, you have to have the impressions. We were talking this morning about it. It's not everything you can do in the internet. So, and there's a need for gathering information and for getting the journalism on a new level. And there's a need. Play the Game was always a center of it for many years, but there's also a need, and academics, they have to ask some of the hardworking journalists, and they don't have to let them out of their business. They have to ask, because they like, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about me, I have no bitter feelings, I don't care anymore, but a lot of other guys, a lot of investigative journalists do a very hard work. In European countries, it's not dangerous for yourself, but in other countries, I have colleagues in Russia, and I was sitting in the office together with other friends there. We were sitting in the office of Novaya Gazeta and talking to a guy who was fighting against corruption. And on top, right over him, on top, there were 6 pictures of journalists have been murdered. So, however, academics and others, even sport officials and even NGOs now, Declan Hill was talking about the new tendency, new experts coming out of the blue and getting all the money and all the contracts for advocating federations. There are a lot of investigative journalists, and Play the Game has brought a lot of guys together. You are one of them, and many others. And we are doing the hard work, putting together many, many facts. Some academics use the facts then, paint their pictures, but there is no really cooperation, not a sustainable, and that is necessary.
Before the next question from Sean, short comment from James.
I just wanted to briefly return to the question that was asked to both Niels and to Margaret. I would agree with Margaret, if I understood it correctly, that there is, that we should be more inclusive in terms of our definition of what we're talking about sports. I would also agree that one's got to be careful with generalizations, and not all autocratic regimes are the same. However, I would argue that, just to give you 2 examples, Egypt won the African Cup 3 times under Mubarak. I don't think that you would have seen the same effort, or any effort even close to that, in terms of physical education. Saudi Arabia is developing its first ever national sports plan. It's a national sports plan for men only. There is no physical education in schools. Which also raises the question in terms of their membership in the International Olympic Committee.
Despite the fact that the Saudi royal family actually issued an edict to Parliament that there should be girls' physical education 8 years ago. But Parliament has blocked it because Parliament is full of very orthodox religious leaders.
Thank you. We have a question from Sean.
Yeah, Sean Hamill, Birkbeck College. I had experience with some of our students earlier in the year. We teach a course in sport governance. So we look at FIFA, we look at the IOC, we look at a few federations. If you look at the IOC, they say there are no problems. We have the Salt Lake City scandal. Journalists investigate, something happens. You look at FIFA, everything's okay. Journalists like Andrew investigate. Now we know it's not okay, something happens. There was an extraordinary incident, Play the Game in Iceland, where you had Mr. McQuaid at one end of the table saying everything is fine, David Walsh at the other end saying it's not fine. Nothing happens, journalists investigate, finally something happens. And what the students said, why is sport incapable of reforming itself? Why does it take a handful of people externally? And that's my question, because, as a teacher, we're trying to get people to go into sport to be effective managers, but it's beginning to become a bit of a broken record, actually. It's becoming difficult. No, seriously, as a teacher primarily. The IAAF had an election 2 years ago where they had one result in the electronic voting in the morning, and they reran it in the afternoon, and they got a different result. Now, it's a laugh at one level, but it's not really that funny. And I'm really struggling these days to find an example of a major sport that hasn't reformed itself without a major public crisis initiated by, and it's a handful of enterprising journalists. And I mean, that's my question. Why can international sport not seem to reform itself?
Thank you. I think, Niels, you are the first to have the chance to answer this, and short comments from others, but Niels, and then the next one here.
I mean, the answer...
No, you are not Niels.
I'm
You are
sorry,
Jens.
I'm sorry.
You are Mr.
I'm sorry.
Weinreich. Now it's Mr. Nygaard.
James,
Yeah.
no, Niels.
I think it's fine to have some outside pressure to dig in and look at things. But then I actually do believe and have seen a lot of examples where international organizations actually have revised themselves. We have talked a lot about the IOC, and some are still challenging and criticizing the IOC for the way they are running things. But today, actually, all accounts in the IOC is completely transparent. All accounts about how the cities selected and so on are completely transparent. There are still a lot of problems when you go down to the member organizations, both a number of NOCs and a number of international federations. But actually now the IOC is going ahead with some very strict measures as far as when they give money to FIFA or any other of the international federations, to the NOCs and so on. They demand a lot of things about the accounts and so on. So things are moving, and in the IOC it was those 110, 15 IOC members who were there in 2000 year 2000 when they made all the changes that actually did make those changes. In the UCI, they have now elected a new president, and so I believe that it takes time, but things can change, and things are changing.
Thank you. We are in Aarhus, and the slogan of this city is Aarhus for Progress. And we are also progressing towards the end. So right now there are one short comment from Jens, James, and Margaret, and then we have the final question here.
Of course, I totally disagree with my old friend Niels, because it's not true. There's no transparency in accounts, and you can see the facts. You just have to Google or whatsoever. That is in general still a kind of corrupted system. There are a lot of really criminals still in the IOC, and as long as they are in the IOC, as long as they are in power, so there will be, I wouldn't say not any change, but as long as they have the power, there are no fundamental changes. It's very clear. A lot of things you have said are not true, I'm sorry to say.
Short comment from James.
I think the answer to the question why it's not happening in international sports organizations is the analogy to an independent press. Fact of the matter is that change only takes place under pressure. An independent press functions well when it polices itself. Every time I publish, I put my credibility on the line. And my peers are my harshest critics. The problem is there is no policing, there is no self-policing within international sports organizations, and so by definition, there is no pressure.
Thank you. Margaret?
I think the biggest problem is the lack of vertical accountability. I mean, the IOC is a particular case because of the lack of vertical accountability, but international federations and national federations should be accountable to their members, and members should be asking questions. But there's such a disconnect between the grassroots member and the people who run specific sports that tends not to happen. I'd just like to say one thing about change. Change has come about, for instance, through the women and sport movement, and that has not come about through journalism because most journalists aren't interested in gender inequity. It's come about through academic women creating distributional data which show gross inequities in the sporting structures at national and international level. So let's not think that it's only journalism that brings about change. It's a different kind of change, and it's probably less dramatic, and it doesn't attract media attention, but it has happened over the last 20 years.
Thank you. Last question.
Combination of question and comment for Niels on the point you made about reasons for Denmark to be engaged internationally and to participate in international sports federations. You mentioned a couple of arguments. One, perhaps I thought was missing, was the opportunity for Denmark as a country that in very many sports have traditions, know-how and resources to help the many countries around the world who are lacking all those things and really would benefit from the help in development. But I agree with you about the role, at least in theory or in principle, that you see a country like Denmark playing by being represented in these federations, by being able to convey, share the values, the morals that you stand for. Of course, having tried that myself in a practical way, I see that as more difficult than one might want it to be. And I also doubt that is the only channel which you sort of hinted. It's only through international federations and through Olympic committees that could happen. I think this kind of forum we have here can do a lot. The kind of stakeholders we have represented here can do a lot. But my concern is that just as you mentioned, there are perhaps 20, 30, 40, the number doesn't matter, countries that share those values. Just as I, being here for the third time, see that perhaps when we talk about inclusiveness, not along Margaret's lines, that we are in a very much in a way preaching to the choir. I see people coming here in terms of countries and backgrounds who already believe in the need for change in major ways in terms of values or philosophies in the many areas that we are discussing here. And that perhaps doesn't take us very far. So the bottom line question, would you, Niels, see that the Danish Olympic Committee, through your contacts in the Olympic movement and through financial resources, would be in a position to help combine efforts with Play the Game, so that for future conferences, we will see a much broader representation here, specifically from countries and regions and continents where we have some doubts about these values and these perceptions of need for improvement being shared. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a direct question. I think that in order to have more of the Olympic representatives present at the Play the Game conferences, I think we have to have another tone at these conferences. I think some of the discussions, some of the arguments are too aggressive to really get into a debate where we can engage the other partner. So I think that in order for Play the Game to play a more constructive role towards the good part of the Olympic movement, we need to find another way of talking to each other. But I think that can happen and should happen.
Thank you very much. That was the final comment. And before we give the speakers a round of applause, we invite Jens to the stage. That will be some efforts for him. So it can both be a round of applause for the speakers and for Jens, please.
I'll try to keep a sober tone. When we opened this conference, and we was another set of we than here, because many of you were caught in a storm, and many of those who had arrived in time have now left because they could not be here for many days. But when still there is a virtual we open this conference, we, the organizers, delegated the responsibility of a successful conference to you. And if there were any flaws at this conference, if it was not a success, then it was actually not your fault. You played your part perfectly. We have had an astonishing amount of excellent presentations in a very respectful tone. If you had been here, Niels, you would also know. And it has been so content-rich that the main frustration has been that it has been impossible to be in 4 halls at the same time. Hopefully we can make up for that with some of the video and audio we will put on the internet. But I would really like to say and stress that in the sometimes dull, hard, frustrating work of building up a conference, it is always nice to have the last conference as a refreshing memory, because you have this feeling that one day we meet, it will all give some meaning. And it has really given a lot of meaning, the way that you have realized the intentions of this conference. I'm not going to summarize the conference. I will face some consequences of delegating the responsibility, is that many of you have given some also critical comments to this that I'm actually not, I'm sure, in a good position to answer, because I am a middle-aged European, solid middle-class male, and so any kind of defense from my side would from the outset fail. And furthermore, I would say the values that are behind that criticism are values that I actually share fully. So I can only share the wish that has been expressed, that we will include more women, more athletes, more people from distant continents at the next Play the Game conference. And I ask for your kind help to provide the financing, the ideas, the proposals, the expertise that can help us get in that direction, because God knows we have tried. I will not reopen the discussion of sports governance. I will say it is of vital importance that there are people inside the sports system that are ready to argue for change. But as Niels also has clearly pointed out, it's a small minority that are driven by those values that we propagate here. So I kindly invite, in the most respectful tone, this minority to accept the external forces to battle the drums and blow the horns and make a lot of the democratic noise that President Dilma of Brazil loves so much, and that I have referred to earlier today and in our opening speech. I think this is your only chance for bringing sport a little bit further. There might be some unpleasant noise now and then, but I'm sure that, like anything else in life, it will pass. If there is anything that I think can justify the kind of debates here, it is that sport, like all other sectors of society, in order to improve, in order to protect its values, need open communication. there are certain factors that really makes it very difficult to keep that communication open in sport, and that's not only from the inside of sport that you have active and passive resistance. It's also the outside society that has a responsibility to keep the dialogue about sport alive. I must say that although in many ways we can see an improvement in the sports debate and the international sports agenda over the past years, we can also repeatedly see that investigative journalists, or just journalists, are in no way supported, that one after the other goes bankrupt, that lawsuits or lawsuit threats, sometimes successfully, get them out of business. And this is really a very concrete obstacle. Our friend Osaso Obayuwana, now I have learned it's with N and not M, sorry for that in the program, has suggested in earlier conversations that we have a whistleblower fund. I don't know who would pay to that whistleblower fund, but I invite you to consider how we can construct mechanisms and funds in sport that can give support to those people who are under real threat, like also whistleblowers internally from sport. We have had quite a few over the years at Play the Game conferences. You may remember Sandro Donati, who was so fortunate that he was considered a state employee in Italy. His own employers filed 11 lawsuits against him in order to get rid of all his inconvenient data and his difficult arguments. And they lost them all because the reality in the courts was different from the reality in sport when you said if a person is right or wrong. Now, we have Mario Goichman as an example I've mentioned. I'll just say we have numerous cases like this, and we need to support the whistleblowers. Last, I would like to say, we are discussing whether or not certain sports leaders from certain countries should be allowed to be in sport, should be boycott events. There are many dangers in this world. Should we distance ourselves from them? Should we have sports festivals in secluded environments where we can be sure that all values are correct? I think not. That would leave us all with Iceland as the only possible host nation. And even in Iceland, we've seen how wrong that can go. I think we should, on the contrary, go very actively in and use sports organizations and sports events as an occasion to create this dialogue between cultures about which values do we want to mark sport and which values do we want to underline humanity. The Olympics always say, celebrate humanity. I think it's a beautiful slogan, but I think there's a big part of humanity, for instance, the right to free speech, that is somehow forgotten in that festivity. I think we should underline that these mega events in China, Russia, Baku, wherever we feel there are some deficiencies, that we use those for dialogue, and that the countries that seek these events should accept that when they ask for a place in the limelight, this light will shine also on some of the sides of the society that they did not want us to see. Well, you have all done, in my view, a contribution that will inspire us for some time ahead. I look much forward to following some of the sessions that I could not be on the internet. And I hope also you will use the next few hours where we are going to have a party to consolidate and rethink your networking. And I hope that you will all carry not only good memories, but also new information and inspiration and motivation for your future work with your home. You have inspired us. Thanks a lot.